Nicky Campbell, welcome to The Big Questions. Great to see you. Tomorrow, 3 Muslim terrorists will be sentenced for plotting to blow up 7 transatlantic planes. Who knows how many innocent people would have been killed? Our first big question, does Islam encourage violence? This MP says that Islamic extremism has a real problem with violent adherents. Politics. We're back at Ashton Park School in Bristol with a very lively and intelligent West Country audience waiting to play their part. And sitting on high this morning for you, we have got the Imam and member of the Muslim Council of Britain, Sheikh Ibrahim Mogra, Director of the Centre for Social Cohesion, Douglas Murray, and the novelist and religious commentator, Christina Adone. Friday marked the 8th anniversary of 9/11, 8 years ago, when nearly 3,000 people were killed and more than 6,000 were injured by Islamist terrorist attacks. In the years since, we've had bombings in Bali, Madrid, London, Mumbai, to name just a few, and they've murdered over 2,000 more. Does Islam encourage violence? That is our first big question. Farouk, from the Bristol Muslim Cultural Society, we hear all the time that Islam is a religion of peace. What is it in the faith that encourages some of his adherents to think that they have got a license to kill?
Nothing. It's ignorance. It's nothing to do with the faith at all. It's the fact that, you know, the West is in Muslim countries at the moment bombing the living daylights out of innocent people, and that is inspiring these people. It's giving them a cause. It's giving them a reason to rebel.
So it's totally politics?
Much of it is to do with politics. That's where the trigger point, that's the crisis point. And if we continue to associate Islam and say Islam is a just cause here, Islam is a justifying factor, then we're way off the mark, and we're not be able to tackle the issue.
But Farouk, haven't they got plenty to go on in the scriptures? I mean, it would be kind of difficult to launch a jihad for Jesus, wouldn't it, if you looked at the New Testament? But
well, no, actually you can talk about the Christian army in Africa doing exactly the same thing.
But that was maybe politics. Can I quote this? I will.
So is this.
Yeah, okay. But haven't they got some justification when they read things in the Quran which says, I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve, therefore strike off their heads and strike off every fingertip of them? I mean, it's not love thy neighbour, is it?
No, I mean, that particular verse isn't, but that's not a general Islamic quote. That's a specific quote to a specific point in a specific time in a specific battle. Muslims were outcast, exiled, left their homes for 9 years, persecuted for 9 years, found sanctuary in a new homeland, were migrated, an exodus from Mecca, migrated. Still the enemies of Islam came to them and wanted to wipe them out. At that point, there is a point in Islam. Islam is not a pacifist religion by any stretch, I agree. But there's a point. You continue to turn the other cheek. Yes, it's a continuation of the same message that Jesus brought. Turn the other cheek up to a point.
Up to a point, yes.
Up to a point. You cannot just stand by and watch evil spread throughout the land and do nothing about it.
Douglas Murray.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the big differences, isn't it, between Islam and Christianity? I mean, Christ says, you know, he's asked how many times do I forgive my brother, and he says 7 times, so 70 times 7, an infinite number of times. We have to address, I have to say, it's always a very difficult question. It's always a difficult question to address.
I can also quote from the Bible where Jesus says, I have come not to spread peace, but I've come to bring the sword.
There is one
come to turn brother against the father.
Yes, there is one.
I don't want to turn this into relation about
okay, Farouk, in a minute,
Christian and Islam.
There is indeed a verse in the New Testament that says that. The thing is that we have to address at some point, it's always very awkward to do so, we have to address the nature of the inventors of these religions. Jesus, when he invents Christianity, says all sorts of peaceable things, and on that occasion says, yes, I've come to bring a sword. But Muhammad, when he invented Islam, also gave an example to Muslims. Now, we're very fortunate, of course, that most Muslims don't follow that example, or are unaware of that example, but the fact is that Muhammad himself was a warrior. He beheaded prisoners. He himself was a very violent man. We can't... I would say, and many people who are Muslims, and many of my Muslim friends and colleagues and so on, realize that, you know, Islam gives you, like all religions, a guide to life. But we cannot ignore the violence of Islam's tenets, of the faith itself. When Muhammad very early on in his career...
I follow the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, myself, in a day-to-day life. I don't go around beheading people. No. I do that because the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, acted in a certain way. I give charity, I give talk to my neighbours, I reach out my hand to the elderly. I reach out my hand to
I'm
the
not saying
poor.
you don't. I'm just saying that
That's
what
the
I'm
example
saying
of the
is that
Prophet
we
Muhammad,
cannot,
peace be upon
we can recognise the good things within Islam, the peaceable things in Islam. We cannot pretend that the verses that are violent and the violent doings of Muhammad did not occur, because they did.
John Azuma, you're a theologian. Yeah.
I think that we have to be very honest and very real here, because to deny that there are violent verses in the Quran is really just being plain escapism.
I'm not denying
there are violent verses
in any
the
book.
Quran.
There's
There are-
violent verses in War and Peace.
Just
One second,
let me
in
make the
what? In War
point.
and what?
In War and Peace, I mean, there's violent verses
But that's
everywhere.
fiction. That's not the word of God.
Well,
War and Peace.
Let me finish the point. And I'm saying there are violent verses in the Quran, but I also know there are millions of Muslims who read the same verses and do not go out blowing themselves up.
Precisely,
But
that's the
let
point.
me just finish the point.
Please let him finish.
Let me finish the point. I think the problem is hermeneutics, is interpretation. And different Muslims interpret this differently. You may decide to interpret it differently, but there are other Muslims who take it very seriously, and we cannot sit here and say your interpretation is right and they are wrong.
We can do
Quran
that.
lens is
Ibrahim?
sound.
We can say that that interpretation is wrong. And I totally disagree with Douglas when he says what he said about the blessed messenger Muhammad. He was a man of peace. 1 billion people or more follow his example. We are what we are
Fought a lot
because
of battles,
that.
though, didn't he?
Of course, which
doesn't make him a man of peace.
leader of any community that is a growing community, that is a community under attack from time to time, will not have to resort
Jesus.
to a military campaign? Why do we not look at the fact that the verses of the Quran, which are being misused by misguided Muslims, and we don't deny that, they are Muslims, just as they are, we've had Christian people, we've had Jewish people, we've had all kinds of people who have misused their scripture to justify something. We need to shift the discussion to say,
I ask you one
what
thing?
is, if I can just finish this point, Nikki, is it really the religion, or is it the people who follow those religions who have political motives, or they have criminal intentions? And I don't deny.
If this is the dictated word of God, why did he go on these tribal conflicts in the 7th century? In what way are they slay the infidels wherever you find them?
Yes,
In what way is that relevant to our society now?
If you put a full stop to some of the verses and decontextualize it and try and do a cut and paste job, you will come up with that. If I were to take a group of British soldiers all the way to Germany and we start killing the Germans, and then you ask me why I'm doing that, I say because Sir Winston Churchill said we will fight them on our shores, we'll fight them in there. You cannot decontextualize that.
Here's the problem. It's a very specific problem that Islam has uniquely among the three monotheists.
Muslims might
which
have.
is that Islam,
Not Islam.
Islam continues to find it very hard to drop, I've mentioned this in this program before, it finds it very hard to drop the violent verses because Muslims are still told by their
We
leaders
do not
that
need
they have
to
to
drop those
believe
verses.
the Quran itself was dictated direct to Muhammad, therefore you can't drop the verses and so on. Now, Christians and Jews have managed to get around this. When they have a violent verse in their in scriptures, they say, well, yes, but it's all open to interpretation. The problem for Muslims is that still in the mainstream, in mainstream scholarship, mainstream Islam, if you say that verse in the Quran is there, I admit it's there, but it's rubbish, I'm not going to believe it, I'll throw that one out, you're declared an apostate by your fellow Muslims.
Christina.
And rightly so.
Christina, 1 second. Christina.
What I'd like to know is where was Ibrahim when 9/11 happened? Because right after 9/11, what Islam needed were Muslim leaders who said, that is awful.
And we
That
did that,
is-
you know, we did
What we got instead was lots of flashing pictures from around the globe, from around the Muslim countries, with cheering.
And there were some doctored pictures as well. There was doctored footage. But we were the first. The Muslim Council of Britain was the very first to go on air publicly with no ifs, no buts to condemn that
Evan
violence
Harris,
of this nature
Evan
has no
Harris.
place in
Is there a
in
problem
the world.
is there a problem in the faith?
Clearly there is. I mean, firstly,
Clearly there
is. Clearly there is. There's a particular problem for Islamic extremism. Firstly, I don't think it's fair to say that just because it's more newsworthy to show extremism that there weren't moderate Muslims, many of them condemning what happened and continue to condemn what happens. Secondly, none of this is an excuse for the English Defence League or whatever they call themselves with their rampant racism and Islamophobia. But whatever the various scriptures say, there's a particular problem, clearly, with Islamic extremism. Christian extremism, at its worst, and it can be pretty bad, is very homophobic, and you see
Like
the
the
religious
Crusades.
right. Jewish extremism is peace-breaking by building settlements and so forth. Atheist extremism, the worst that can be said for that is they want to or seeking to ban the burqa. But
Well,
Islamic
I'm sorry, what
extremism...
about Mao? What about Stalin?
Yeah, well, I don't think they did it in the name of atheism. What they didn't do it in the name of atheism. But with Islamic extremism, you've got several problems. It's not just terrorism. You've got the reaction to the Danish cartoons, which then called for murder. You've got, even
that is
out
wrong.
of the context
And
of
that
Iraq and
attitude is wrong.
Afghanistan, you had leading people, including in the Muslim Council of Britain, who I haven't heard apologise for this, burning books.
Yeah.
You have Sharia law. I mean, just looking at women being flogged for wearing trousers. So there is a particular problem of Islamic extremism that doesn't
problem
exist
is-
today
Francis,
in other extremist religions.
is that something inherent in the faith that leads to that violence?
Not at all. I think we've just seen it there, that secularists in this country don't know much about secularism. Stalin absolutely consistently focused on religious communities throughout the Socialist
Not in the
Republic.
name of atheism.
In the name of atheism,
No.
as a contradiction to the revolution.
No.
But the most important thing in this
Politician.
country is if we treat Muslims and other minorities like dogs, right, as we used to say, no dogs, no Irishmen, as on Jersey they say, no Poles, no Portuguese today, and then you get some kind of reaction of alienation, marginalisation, and a reading of a text, which I read it
So
and
it's our
say...
fault?
Yeah, well, because if I read a text and it talks about me being the outcast and being treated like a dog and treating like an
But
infidel,
Muslims in
then
this
of course
country are
this
not treated like
radicalises
dogs.
me.
Wait a second, Douglas, one second.
But Muslims are not treated like dogs. There are no discriminatory measures in this country, and quite rightly not. Whatever you believe in your heart, whatever religion you want to believe in, I think they're ridiculous myself, but I think you can believe what you like, and no one's trying to stop you believing what you like. To pretend that Muslims, are in any way sort of prejudiced against. What, for those of us who are not Muslims, what we notice is too many Muslims, as has been mentioned already, who say, who will riot in the streets and protest about somebody when they draw a cartoon of Muhammad, but when somebody called Muhammad Atta flies a plane into a tower and kills thousands of people, they remain silent. They find the use of their prophet's image in a drawing offensive, but not somebody called after their prophet doing a violent
Francis?
action.
The problem with new think tanks is they have no history. In the 30s, the fascists marched the streets of England, persecuting the black community. In Southampton, the police used to raid Irish parishes, accusing them of being IRA members. There's a dark side to the British identity that we need to name and put right, because cohesion is too important to be lost in shibboleths of misjudgment.
Evan, you want to talk about today? And I want to bring John in, because my friend John here is desperate to come in. Go on, John, say your thing, and then Evan in a second.
It's very easy for us to say that the problem is with Islam, or to say that the problem is with the politicians. But I think that the truth of the matter is that there are seeds of violence in Islamic traditions, but the socio-political situations that happen around the world provide the soil, the fertile soil for these seeds to germinate.
Isn't it a problem for, you said earlier on, it's by no means a pacifist religion. 1 second. Isn't that a problem? Evan in a second as well. Obviously lots of people queuing up, and I'll do my best. Is there a problem? You said it's not a pacifist religion, and Muhammad was a warrior, and it's very easy for some people to infer from that historical fact and infer from the word of God as passed down, as you believe, that they have a right to commit violent acts.
No, I mean, although I said it's not a pacifist religion, everyone's heard the saying, when good people do nothing, evil flourishes. Everyone understands that. Everyone understands that conflict. You cannot just sit by and watch people do crazy things and do nothing about it. Now, people say, well, Muslims got nothing to be worried about in this country. Douglas said it, you know, we're not being discriminatory. By sitting here and saying everything that some of the comments have been made here today, for example, they are discriminatory because you're saying things that you do not understand. You're taking comments. You're taking comments, you know, taking verses out of context. You're blowing them out of all proportion. You're saying that's what Muslims do.
What did you say a few minutes ago about British and Americans bombing? What was your phrase?
Yeah. The F word, foreign policy. You know, nobody wants to say that. Nobody wants to talk about. Hold on,
You used the phrase bombing to smithereens or something.
Yeah,
Isn't that taking our foreign policy out of context?
I'll give you an example.
Do you think we don't mind that?
No, I'm not justifying it. I'm not saying that these people who carry out suicide bombing or kill innocents or target innocents or go out promoting the ideology have any justification whatsoever.
Okay, Evan first. Evan.
Even if foreign policy is wrong, and I oppose a lot of it myself, British government foreign policy, or there is discrimination, which I've also campaigned to end, that is not an excuse for violent extremism. I'm not arguing with you. It's unfortunate we have moderates to argue against here. In a democracy, it's not an excuse. And however badly Muslims are treated, and there is still discrimination that they face, the way they're treated in this country is as nothing as minorities are often treated in religious countries, particularly because they're the main examples.
I'm not talking about foreign policy here.
We have a democracy here. There must be...
You're from Quilliam. You're from Quilliam. You're a moderate group, and you get government money, and you're campaigning against radicalisation. Some of the Ed Hussein and Majid, who are at the top of your organisation, they were former Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a very, very radical group. Yeah. Is there a problem in the interpretation of some of the holy texts?
Definitely. There's definitely a big problem in terms of interpretation. But what we have at the moment is that we have many, many people who are interpreting the text without looking through 14,000 years of scholarship. We're not going back to the way people interpreted it back in the days when, you know, when we had different scholars interpreting the text for their different contexts. Now today we need British Western scholars who can interpret the text and apply them to modern society. There is definitely a problem in interpretation.
It's not a problem with interpretation of text. Al-Qaeda ideology is not a problem about interpretation of the text. Al-Qaeda ideology is simply one of revenge. They don't want to go to the text. They are circumventing the text. What they are saying is they are killing you can kill them. It's nothing to do with the text.
These movements started way before we launched wars in Iraq, before we launched wars in Afghanistan.
I'm talking about Al-Qaeda-inspired ideology.
And that began way before Muslims were being attacked in various Muslim-majority countries. It's not just a revenge attack. There is an ideology behind it, and it's a political ideology. I'm not saying it's religious-based, but it's an ideology behind it.
Please, let him respond. So what is the problem?
The problem we're dealing with today is a modern political ideology that is basing a lot of their ideas on religious texts. I'm not saying there's a problem with the religion inherently, but I'm not saying they're interpreting the religion in their own way and using it to justify their political opinions.
Because it is open to interpretation. Isn't that the problem? Religious texts are open to interpretation.
That any religious text, whether be it Christian, Muslim, whatever, there are millions of interpretations, and the problem is not Islam specifically, the problem is religion, because if you say to me that you're a big fan... if you say to me, Nicky, that you're a big fan of David Cameron's ideas, I can say to you, if I choose to, well, I think you're an idiot, I think his ideas are ridiculous. But if you say to me, I'm a big fan of the ideas of the Prophet Muhammad, and I say, well, I think you're an idiot and his ideas are ridiculous, that's an outrageous and controversial statement. We have to be allowed to question these things, and unfortunately, the way that religion works is you're not allowed to question these things, you have to believe it on faith. That is what it's dangerous.
In Islam...
In actual fact, I have had this checked, and the commentaries and the manuals all agree that the jihad texts are still very much in force, and the peaceable verses have been abrogated. Yes. That is the problem with Islam. It does actually advocate violence. And I think we can look around the world and we can see many, many examples of where Islam has been violent.
If we wanted to take stuff from the Bible, the Old Testament, we could you know, go and destroy the world on that basis. What is the difference?
The difference is that the Old Testament applied in that particular time. There were injunctions for particular places and particular people who were doing child sacrifice and whose religion was prostitution. God told the Jews to wipe them out. There was a good reason for that. He's God, he has the right to do that. Okay. The difference with Islam is it's supposed to be immutable, and this is why they cannot issue a fatwa to say all the violent verses have been abrogated, because they cannot.
If that were true, why don't we have a billion-strong Muslim army in the world? If that were true, every Muslim would have to carry out the injunctions of the Quran. The verses of the Quran, which people choose to justify their violent behavior, are cut out and used just as segments. The very verses that you make reference to are followed by certain verses that talk about. In fact, when the Muslims picked up arms, it was if you look at the hermeneutics of the verses, the Muslims are given permission to pick up arms in defense. The verses also continue to say, if the enemy offers a hand of peace, you make peace. Islam inherently is about peace. It is about peace. But Muslims have misuse the religion, and I'll be the first to condemn them. Violence, extremism has no place in Islam, has no place in anywhere in the world.
To say Islam is a religion of peace is as ridiculous as saying it is a religion of violence. Neither is true. It is a convoluted.
But you just said it is a religion of violence.
There is violence within it, and there is some peaceful statements within it. But the question comes back again to why Muslims cannot get through the stage that Christianity and Judaism went through and say, if it says slay the infidel wherever you find him, we don't. It's not just that we won't do it, which is why most Muslims, as you say, are entirely peaceable. They don't follow the scriptures' injunction in its place. It's that they say not only are we not going to do that, but it would be wrong if we were to, and that verse must go. We must drop that.
But we already have that system. We already have.
This is the reason why. This is the reason why. This is the reason why we still do not have a mainstream school of Islam in the world that will drop the verses which permit the murder of those who leave Islam. We still are waiting for the fatwas from the mainstream schools which are going to say, if you apostatize from Islam, no, you should not be killed.
This gentleman's had his hand up for a long time. Make a brief point, please, sir.
Very briefly. The question about Islam taking a lot of stick here is the Muslims, the terrorists in Islam have hijacked religion for their own ends. The fight is between the West foreign policy against the Eastern policy. For a long, long time they've been trying to get rid of the corrupt rulers in the Middle East, the Shah, the king in Saudi Arabia, etc., etc. But they've been sustained by the West in the opposition.
But we're also talking about, that's one thing, but it's the scriptural justification which is up for debate here. Yes, sir, go on. You had your hand up right at the beginning. I'm so sorry to come in.
Imam just said that Islam is a religion of peace. We should really understand what he means by that. When Muslims say religion of peace, they mean when all the world obey under Islamic law. This is the kind of peace that they mean. And they mean that this peace must be reached by violence.
Not at all. Back there, good morning. Are you finding this an interesting debate?
Yes, I am. I've wanted to say that for a long time. I mean, I want to start. First of all, go back right to the beginning. The description of the Prophet Muhammad that Douglas gave, I don't recognise it at all. It's utter and complete nonsense.
Well, it's not.
The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when he conquered Mecca after he was exiled,
when he liberated,
and he did not, he liberated Mecca, and he did not resist. He did not resist, and he conquered. He took over, returned to Mecca at the invitation of the Meccans, and it was a bloodless, peaceful conquest. You tell me which major leader has managed to take over a whole region through a peaceful, bloodless conquest?
John. Okay, one second, John.
It wasn't bloodless when
you asked a question. You asked a question.
You know, people are not making the point. It's inherently Islam that is the problem. It's not. It's Muslims. I mean, every fire needs fuel. Every fire needs fuel, and nothing exists in a vacuum.
Yes, one second, Christina. John.
I just wanted to say, Ibrahim made a point that it's about interpretation, but it's true that there are Muslims themselves recognize that interpretation is a problem and abrogation is a problem, and that the Mecca verses which are peaceful have been abrogated by Medina verses which are much more belligerent. But there was a Muslim scholar, a Sudanese Muslim scholar in 1985, who said that for his own understanding of the Quran, the Mecca peaceful verses should abrogate the Medina more belligerent verses. That man was executed for blasphemy. And I think this is the problem in Islam, that we need to accept there's a problem here, and Muslims have to take risks to address it.
Okay, listen, we must leave it. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you all for taking part.